My name's Maggie Brown. I'm talking to you today from a couple hats. First of all, I'm a psychotherapist and I've worked with gifted adults for an awfully long time. I'm also a psychological researcher. Also, my specialty in that is trying to understand more about gifted adults. I guess another hat I should tell you about is that I do identify myself now as being gifted, although I was never identified as that as a kid, apart from a high IQ. Now, one of the confusing things is that if you start reading, you'll find that nobody really agrees on what giftedness is. If you have had anything to do with gifted education or gifted children, you know that. So it's the same with gifted adults. So I'll tell you what I think. When I talk about a gifted adult, I talk about somebody who's a quick thinker, complex thinker, doesn't see things in black and white and in boxes. In fact, when they feel something's being boxed, they go, yeah, but have you thought about it this way? Yeah, but have you thought about it that way? Somebody who probably feels things intensely, digs deep into something, has some sensitivities, whether that's emotional sensitivities, physical sensitivities, doesn't settle for less than excellent in themselves if they can, and is often tired. We speak quickly, we speak our minds, often to our social detriment. We may not always be top of everything. In fact, we may not aspire to that. The way I just said that sounds like a category, but there's every shade of gray. Some people I know have all those qualities and also are dyslexic. Some of those people that I know who have all those qualities also suffer emotional issues such as depression or anxiety. Some of that has to do with not being understood, not being able to identify themselves in a healthy way. Some of it has to do with our personality. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is why I think it's important that we start a conversation now about giftedness across the lifespan, and specifically move away from a focus on children, move away from a focus on education, and start talking about what happens after the age of 18. So before I start, I'm going to also talk about what I'm not going to talk about and why. I've been working with gifted adults for a lot of years, and I am one. And so both personally and professionally, I know how important it is to handle the understanding of your giftedness carefully. For most of us, we've lived a life without understanding our difference. Maybe wondering about ourselves, maybe not sure about how to even talk about ourselves. Most of us wouldn't have a clue that some of our differentness, some of our different ways of being in the world actually is tied to giftedness. It's a very personal journey. It often involves a degree of grief, some self-identification process that we go through, shifting away from thinking about ourselves in one way, transferring that to another, and often shakes up our world a bit. So rather than dig too personally today, I'm going to talk about the 5 reasons I think it's essential that we start a conversation about giftedness in adulthood. So reason number 1, I think there's been some mistakes being made, and it's hurting us. And when we talk about giftedness in childhood and giftedness in education, there's a myth that develops. And that myth is that we're strong. In fact, we're invincible. In fact, we can do anything. A gifted child should and can do anything without a lot of support, without a lot of help. That's the mythology. Bad enough in childhood. But when we move away from that in adulthood, what often happens is we take on the sense that everything's easy. I should be able to do everything. I should be able to do anything. And I should be able to do it alone without help. Until we start talking about some of the inner qualities of giftedness, that myth holds us in a trap. And the trap is that we tend to do far too much beyond our capacity as a single human being alone. And we fail to seek the help because the mythology says we don't need any help. So That's reason number one. We'll call that the mistake reason. Reason number two, we'll call that the difference reason. There's this word that I've come across lately, it's called othering. And what that means is a sense of the people around someone sensing that the person is different and creating of them, you're the other. I think that happens a lot with gifted adults. If we were ever labeled gifted, that's long gone. Most of us were never labeled gifted. We have a sense of our own difference and we interact differently with the world. When we interact differently with the world notices. People notice. And we get set aside as someone who's a bit different or other. And the risk there is when you're othered, people will decide on a label. Catalyst for me doing this work is I've seen too many people who are gifted, intelligent, creative, complex, intense people being mislabeled and misdiagnosed, often as bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, neurotic, trouble, too much, not okay. Unless we have a conversation about what giftedness looks like in adulthood, people are going to mislabel and other. So that's reason number two. Reason number one was we're mistaken is indestructible. Reason number two is the othering. The difference without the label gets mislabeled. Reason number three has to do with the focus of gifted education. And gifted education is focused on high achievement and competition. High achievement, consistently high achievement in competition. That may or may not be appropriate for schools. That's for gifted ed people to decide. It assumes an aspiration. It assumes a desire to be eminent and be seen to be the best. My experience with gifted adults is almost the opposite. What I know is that high level of consistent achievement and the competitive spirit is not the reality for most of the gifted adults I work with. It assumes an aspiration. It assumes a desire to be eminent. Most of the people that I work with want to connect, want to collaborate. They don't care about being top of the pack. They care about excellence, and they're capable of excellence, but they actually don't fit the stereotype. So reason number three has to do with a misperception of the aspiration for eminence and constant high achievement. I think we need to start a new conversation. Reason number four, this has to do with the self. How do we understand ourselves? Particularly if ourselves are different. We perceive that we're not quite fitting in. We think differently. We often think too quickly. We're the one in the room where there's a committee trying to solve some complex problem, and we've solved it 2 seconds after we came in the room. We're the ones going, I know the answer to that one. Getting the whiteboard out, drawing the most complex thing you can imagine. Well, how do we understand ourselves? How do we understand ourselves when we have to turn the news off because what's being spoken is so upsetting to us that we need to go cry? How do we understand those sensitivities? How do we understand who we are when our life is full of passion and intensity and we get bored with things quickly and we get frustrated with things quickly when we're bored? Well, there are a lot of labels that can be put on us. We talked about the othering. One of the reasons we have to have this conversation now is so that we don't put those labels on ourselves. And if we already have, I'm too much, I'm bad, I'm loud, I'm too quiet, I should shut up, I say too much. If we've already adopted those labels, we need to find ways to understand ourselves differently. That's reason number 4. We need to have this conversation. And the 5th reason, this is the loneliness reason. I've already mentioned boredom. My experience is that loneliness and boredom are the most important issues for us to talk about. if there's one and only one reason to start the conversation about what it's like to be a gifted adult, it's to allow us to know that there are others like us. We're not alone. Most of the people I work with find eventually that they're part of an amazing pack. And they find others who, like them, for years have thought that their differentness was some pathology, something that was wrong with them, and that they needed to be quiet and hide and fit in. The qualities I'm talking about include quick thinking, ability to deal with complexity, no black and white thinking, categories are blurred, often the ability to see or in other ways sense something that other people don't, and quickly. We may not always do the social niceties. We think quickly, we speak before we think because our thoughts are racing. What a joy to understand that there's others in the world like this, and what a joy to get together. But first we need to understand that giftedness does not end in childhood, and that there are others out there. There's a whole pack of us. So I've deliberately kept this slightly impersonal, and I'm sorry if that's frustrating. What I've said to my clients over the years is it's not my job to re-traumatize, and I'll try not to do that. Or discovering something about yourself can be difficult. It can be a shock, and it's not my aim here. But if it sparked your interest, either for yourself or someone you know, there are some good references out there. One thing that you're going to discover, if you haven't already, is that the concept of a gifted adult isn't well known. And health professionals, counselors, doctors, psychotherapists, psychologists are unlikely to understand if you go in seeking some advice, seeking some help, and using that term. One of my goals in life is to change that, and I'm trying to work with the medical profession around that. Seek out, if you can, someone like myself who's got the specialty. We're rare and few and far between, but we do exist. One of my favorite resources is written by a psychotherapist from the States, Paula Prober. You can find her information at Rainforest Mind. Mary Ellen Jacobson wrote a wonderful book called The Gifted Adult, and a beautiful book called Living with Intensity. It's for all ages. My friend Ellen Fiedler recently put out a book called Bright Adults. A lovely way to think about the entire lifespan in different stages. I'm so glad we were able to start this conversation. Thank you. Kia ora.